It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hadn't seen him in 20 years. It's a pleasure to be back in the United States for hopefully a brief period. How many of you are from other countries? Could I see your hand? How many of you have been in other countries since you've been a Baha'i? How many of you would like to be in other countries? Allah Baha'i. I appreciated very much what our friend was saying about the changing face of the United States. Actually, we can expand it to the changing face of the entire world. How many of you are pioneering in other countries? Now, could you stand? It's always a pleasure to have people from many, many cultures and backgrounds in an audience, and it's almost inevitable in a Baha'i conference. This is not a normal conference. At any time you're speaking to Baha'is, you're speaking to Baha'is from many different nations or people who have been in many different nations. No other size group you speak to around the world do you have so many people from so many places, from so many backgrounds. It's also a real privilege to be at a conference where they have a special conference for little children. Baha'i children are very bright. We know that. I was talking with some the other day. They were playing cards, only they had a dog playing the fourth hand over here. And the dog was winning. I watched for a while. And I said, you know, that's a smart dog you've got there. Kid looked up and said, he's not so smart. He wags his tail every time he gets a good hand. You know. We Baha'is are smart, but a lot of times we overlook the obvious. I worked for a month on a talk, and last night, yesterday afternoon actually, I had an experience that it upset me in a way that I hadn't expected it to. You sort of get yourself used to being a Baha'i to not get upset about things happening. But in our workshop yesterday afternoon, I asked a very simple question, and I was amazed at the answer that came back. Because every Baha'i knows clearly that when we receive a letter from our infallible body, the Universal House of Justice, it truly is for us a letter from God. Is it not? We all know that. Recently, we received this beautiful Rizwan letter from the House of Justice. Everyone in this room has read it. I asked the simple question, what was it the House of Justice asked us to ponder? Not a person there could tell me. One person gave me part of it. I was amazed. And then I happened to think, you know, a sense of humor is necessary to survive. It's a survival skill. And I happen to remember that Shoghi Effendi, speaking to a pilgrim once, asked him had he read the Kitab-i-Gan, and of course yes, he had read it. And he said, Shoghi Effendi replied, yes, I know, Baha'is read the Kitab-i-Gan like they tour Rome. And I pondered about that. And then I got to going back through Kitab-i-Gan, and Baha'u'llah in so many places, page after page, says ponder. And then he makes another paragraph or two or statement. He says reflect. And you ask the average American Baha'i, if there is such a thing, when Baha'u'llah says ponder it, do you stop and ponder it? No, they don't ponder it. They go right on. Ponder means ponder. Look it up in the dictionary. It means think about it. House of Justice said ponder something. Now, the House of Justice is as close as you and I are going to get to God in this world as far as getting His guidance. And they said ponder something. And if you haven't pondered it, seriously, without being presumptuous or pretentious, I ask you why you haven't. Why haven't you pondered what they said ponder in that letter? Because I think if you will answer yourself honestly, you will learn something about yourself, and it will help you. Helps me. The first thing we learn from Abdu'l-Baha is that we are to acquire spiritual qualities in this life to enable us to function in the next life. We all know that, right? But he said one quality is necessary before all other qualities to function in the next life. What qualities are needed to function in the next life? Knowledge of God, faith in God, and he lists many. But he lists one quality first. And without it, you can't have the others. You can't have faith. And you know what he said it is. It's truthfulness and honesty. It's truthfulness. And the only way you and I are going to ever have contact for up-to-date truth on what's important now is from the House of Justice. I've served on national assemblies in more places than one. We make mistakes on national assemblies. The House of Justice doesn't make any. The House of Justice can write and ask your National Assembly or some other National Assembly to research some serious question of import in that country or that area. And you may be the person with one or two of your fellow members or someone serving on the National Assembly assigned that duty and do the very best you can with all your heart, mind, and soul, and you still may make a mistake. You make your report back to Haifa, and if they made their decision, if it had to be made on your report, and you made a partial error, then you're going to get partial infallibility, and they don't make mistakes. They don't make mistakes. I'm sure there are many others in this room that could do just as I can and tell you story after story of our experiences with the House of Justice. They don't make mistakes. Normally, a National Assembly will have a meeting, and you send your minutes to the Haifa immediately. And you know you don't have another assembly meeting for some time where the assembly goes back and corrects any errors, right? I have sent minutes as the Secretary of a National Assembly and had the House of Justice to instantly correct them. I've had minutes corrected before I sent them. In all fairness, if it was not for the House of Justice, we would have so many different Baha'i, little Baha'i this, Baha'i that, we would never have unity. It is our center of the covenant in this day. And in this message, they said, ponder. It's hard sometimes to feel close to a body like the House of Justice for many people. It was easier for those of you who are older, I think, honestly, it's just my opinion, to feel closer to an individual like Shoghi Effendi, Abdu'l-Baha. You could totally focus your heart, even pray to them. House of Justice, it's a little more difficult. But it's important to consciously develop that feeling about our House of Justice, because it has to do with the truth. And our salvation depends on the truth, not our misconceptions of it. I waked up last night at 3:30 in the morning, couldn't go back to sleep because evidently in my sleep I was worried about that experience yesterday afternoon. That's not a simple thing to ask you when you got a letter from God Almighty Himself and He told you to do something, and it's only been recently you got it and you don't even remember what He told you to do. Now, you know and I know if Shoghi Effendi had written you that, you would have done exactly what he said. Those of you who are older will remember back in the 10-year crusade, our African friend and native believer in Africa, Bill Sears, our beloved hand of the cause, went all over the country telling about it. They were in a conference. Of course, Shoghi Effendi, I guess Dr. Mahajer inherited that quality from him or something. Action, movement, action, movement. The greatest praise he could give you was action. And they asked this man in this conference, he said, if you got a letter from Shoghi Effendi, what would you do? He said, I'd read it on the train. He knew to be moving, you see. Now, the House of Justice is the most wonderful thing in the world today. It's our only hope of salvation. We have none without it. And it's a very personal house of justice, as God is a personal God as defined by Shoghi Effendi. And we know what he said. When I was serving in this country on this National Assembly, I had the great bounty of being at Rizvan the first year of the election of the House of Justice after their election. Had the great bounty of opening the 9-year plan and reading a prayer there. Just a gift of God. As Shoghi Effendi said, we're saved by grace, but we're rewarded by our works. But only out of His mercy does God even permit us to exist. Baha'u'llah tells us that, page 75 and 76 in Gleanings. And later, I was elected to this National Assembly and had the great bounty of being the only member of it. To pioneer during their first plan overseas, and in a brief period of time witnessed His power in the Pacific to set up one new National Assembly. Then quickly, that National Assembly produced 4 National Assemblies, just like that, all with the power of Baha'u'llah. Went into that area, there was 2 local assemblies. Within 1 year, there were 37. All but the power of Baha'u'llah. Nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with us. Just the fact that we happened to be there and Baha'u'llah could use us because we were there. That's all. Baha'u'llah never says, be this, be that. All He says is arise. Get up, move. If you will, God will use you. He will more than compensate for any shortcomings you have. When I got to my first pioneer post, I assumed a position that I had worked hard to get. A man came on the floor of this hospital. I was setting up the first mental health center in the Marianas Islands, in that whole part of the world. Never had one. It's almost against the culture and the religion of the area to have that type of thing. And this man came walking on the floor one day and said, well, I'm the new administrator. And I said, is that so? You know, because I had left. I had personal responsibilities, as you have. My livelihood depended on that function. I knew nothing about this man, had never seen him. Turned out, as in politics so often happens, there's been a little collusion here, and the governor of that area had contracted as a political payoff to this man to give him my job, and he was going to just ease me over here, pay me out a contract, and that was it. Well, in the first place, thank God I didn't go there for the money. I could have cared less for it, except it met my obligations. I went there to serve Baha'u'llah. And I was desperate. And you and I have been desperate before, and we will be desperate again. And I had this lovely friend who was friend of so many of you in this room in Haifa, Mr. Faizi, our hand of the cause, and I wrote him my situation. And I had a personal problem in my life, and he wrote back that very day he got the letter and said, the moment I got your letter, I went to the shrine of the Bab and said prayers for you. And then he said this, I felt the personal problem was resolved, but I couldn't handle the problem about your employment. A hand of the cause said that. I now have taken your request, your need, to the House of Justice and asked them to say prayers for you. And they said they would say prayers for you in the morning at 9 a.m. I knew nothing about this. Here I am trying to hang on to that little pioneer post out in the middle of the Pacific. The next day, later, we were able to synchronize the time, the exact time the House of Justice went to pray in that shrine. I was called with other individuals that had been employed. A wonderful Baha'i psychiatrist was with us, 3 social workers, and a psychologist. We were called to the office of the governor's representative. And he explained the fact, I was going to be set aside. And this is what happened in that meeting. Only the power of Baha'u'llah could have done this, because these other individuals were not Baha'i, except for this doctor friend of mine. Every one of them said, well, if he goes, we go. Here's our letter of resignation. The governor ate crow right there. He backed off. And Baha'u'llah saved my job. But he saved it through the power of the prayers of the House of Justice. Now, those of you who stood and are pioneering now know how difficult it is at times to stay at a pioneer post. If you're in a very isolated pioneer post, there's no one to come by and say, good job, well done, hang on. A lot of times you're faced with all types of difficulties, but knowing in your heart of hearts you've got that kind of house of justice, you can hang on through anything the world can throw at you. Unfortunately, in my life, I had a broken marriage, and I was pioneering out of this country, and that leaves a lot of hurt and pain in the heart of a person. And I met a young lady in Taiwan, and we wanted to get married. She had been a devoted pioneer in Taiwan, Japan, Philippines for many years, was serving as a board member there. And we wanted to get married, and we got permission from her parents. Until her father, who was a devoted Roman Catholic, found out I had been divorced. And he said, he wrote immediately, "I can't give you permission." Impossible. Because my wife, even though she had been behind many years, at least my potential wife, she had been raised Roman Catholic, confirmed in the church, and according to her father's belief, she had to stay that, making a difference what she thought about herself and her soul. And I was disturbed, obviously, very disturbed. And I called the priest in Hawaii. We were back at Hawaii for a youth conference. And she had flown in from Taiwan. I had flown in from Guam, or Samoa, from somewhere out there, because I traveled a lot with my work. And the priest laughed at me. He said, "Oh, her father's right. You can't get married." Well, you know, man schemes and God schemes, but God's the greatest of schemers, right? And boy, when you want to get married, you can scheme, and I was scheming. You know, I'm not a quitter if it's something I want. And I got a friend of mine to intercede, a lovely lady who's been pioneering many, many, many years out in the Pacific, Roxanne Terrell. Many of you know her. And she called my wife's father over here in this country, down in Florida, and negotiated and talked, and at least talked him into going to see a priest. Well, he'd already been to see a priest. He said it wasn't necessary. The priest told me to do this. He confirmed my action. And she said, well, go over his head. So he did. Thank God, my father-in-law now, he's my father-in-law now, he went to see the bishop of the Catholic Church. Now, in the meantime, in desperation, I cabled the House of Justice. Oh, beloved Dwight yesterday was saying, be audacious. When you get desperate, you'll be audacious. I cabled the House of Justice and told him my problem. What an audacious, pretentious person, right? Make no difference. So I did that. And the House of Justice cabled back, loving letter, warm prayers. But if you don't get approval, you can't get married. I tell you, I prayed that night. But the House of Justice said they'd pray. Next day, we got word that my wife's father had gone to the bishop, and the bishop didn't just give permission, he told him to give permission. The bishop of the Catholic Church said give permission. He was obedient Catholic. He gave permission. Now, I had this hurt in my heart. You can't help but have it if you've had a broken marriage. And we went to this wonderful gathering of the friends that they gave us for our marriage. And we had both had many friends from that part of the world, my wife particularly for having worked out there so long. And Mr. Sears, Mr. Fazey, Mr. Featherstone were the ones who conducted our marriage, and 4 counselors. And we had people there from over 20 countries of the world, all because the House of Justice prayed for it, as far as I'm concerned. We were sitting comfortably, newlyweds, right? God have mercy on them. They better enjoy their lollipops. Sitting comfortably, and we get a call late at night from our beloved hand, Mr. Sears, wanting us to go pioneer to Western Samoa. Well, you know, what are you going to do? A hand that calls asks you to do something that you love the way we loved him. Yeah, we'll go. No, didn't have to consult on something like that, and we went. For a time after we got there, we were the only Baha'i pioneers there because the others had to leave. And of course, we already knew they had to build this beautiful temple that's now been built. And my wife was pregnant. After we'd been there 3 months, it rained almost every day. Rain, mud, and we would slosh down to a place to have a deepening. No one would show up. Those of you who pioneered know that kind of life. It's par for the course, right? Par for the course. Now, but it's depressing. Come on. You ever tried to play golf for 3 months in the rain? So, Mr. Sears, in his kindness, came to visit us. For 5 days, he stayed in our home. In fact, my wife was quite large at that time, expecting our first child. He used to put his hand right on her tummy and say, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And came time for the birth, and we had practiced this Lamaze method, and everything had gone perfectly. And came time for the delivery. My wife went to the hospital, and a medical complication arose that we hadn't anticipated. No one had. My wife was losing blood. And in Samoa, as in many countries in this world, the Social Security system depends on the number of children you have, does it not? Some of you in that type of world, I'm sure, here. The more children you've got, when you get old, you go stay with this one a while, that one a while, and so forth. So for a woman to not have 8, 9, 10, 11 kids is not a very wise thing in that type of world. And this lady, who was the physician in charge of the delivery of newborn babies, was not about to perform a cesarean section operation on my wife because she wanted her to have many children. Very altruistic as my wife was dying. Now, friends, it's a very difficult thing. It's easy for me to stand here and tell you this, but we were suffering there. We were in a country where there was not one medical doctor. They had what they call medical officers. They're not medical doctors. 1, 2, 3 days my wife was losing blood. And then came independence celebration for the independent nation of Western Samoa where we were living. 3 more days. And the lady just barely came in, looked in the door and left. 6 days my wife losing blood. They said you're going to have to get blood for, as you're giving blood here for. And no one would give blood. We were Palangis, white skin. It's nice for you white-skinned Baha'is to pioneer to another country. You know how it feels to be of a dark skin in this country. It's a good experience. It's a humbling experience. Nevertheless, I was desperate, and I cabled Haifa. What you gonna do? I prayed the paint off the walls. It didn't do any good. My wife was dying. Well, that cable arrived there. We got cable back the next day. And later we learned what happened. Also sent a cable to Mr. Sears, to Mr. Fazey. They cabled back. Both of them were going to say prayers immediately. But my wife had a dear friend, Marian Gorski, who was working there and asked me to cable her. I cabled her. And when she got her cable, this beloved member of the House of Justice at that time, Amos Gibson, was looking over her shoulder, and he read that cable. And he immediately dropped what he was doing, gave up his work at the World Center, and drove all the way around the Bay of Aka to the shrine of Baha'u'llah and said, the tablet of Ahmad for my wife. The next morning, I was down at the hospital there, and in comes a new doctor. What happened to the old doctor? Well, someone had died in her family, and she couldn't come. This man was filling in, and he looked at my wife briefly and called me in. He said, look, I've got to operate on your wife. We're going to lose your baby and your wife. I said, I know that. I've known it all week. So they did. And have a beautiful child whom we named after Mr. Fazey and Mr. Sears, William Fazey. When we had our second child, we named him after Mr. Gibson. Later, I saw Mr. Cavillon, member of the House of Justice. I don't know Mr. Cavillon any better than I know you gentlemen sitting in the front row. By some spirit of osmosis, he recognized me, came over, embraced me, and said, "Did you get our cable?" Now that's your House of Justice. It's personal, it's warm, it's supportive. And they've written us and they say, ponder something. Ponder something. And I don't want to go through what they say ponder. I just call it to your attention and ask you to go back and read page 45 and 46 in World Order Baha'u'llah, which is in reference to what they say ponder. But read what they say to ponder. And I do want to share with you this statement that many of you have not had the bounty of hearing. I had not had it before 2 weeks ago. It's a statement from the Universal House of Justice written to the Baha'i youth in Innsbruck, Austria. And it's a statement about the time in which you're living and your children are living. We're asked to do certain things in the lives of our children as parents. You know, if you have small children, in a sense, God forbid, but in a sense, you're God to that child. You are a role model, as God is a role model through Abdu'l-Baha for us. But everything your children see you do, they do. They don't do what you say. They do what you do. Now, the House of Justice wrote this, and I'd just like to read it. And if you haven't heard it, you better fasten your seatbelts, because this is the Word of God Almighty speaking. They say this generation of Baha'i youth enjoys a unique distinction. You will live your lives in a period when the forces of history are moving to a climax, when mankind will see the establishment of the lesser peace, and during which the cause of God will play an increasingly prominent role in the reconstruction of human society. Now, I'm going to renege on what I said. I can't resist it. In our Rizwan message, the House of Justice asks us to ponder the meaning of the oneness of mankind. And quote beloved Guardian where he said, it implies an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. We know where Shoghi Effendi says in Citadel of Faith, the United States of America will play the preponderating role in the establishment of the lesser peace. The United States of America. He goes further and says the United States of America will be the first nation to raise the standard of the most great peace. This nation. And you see how he's doing it. Dr. Jones went through all the statistical evidence to show how he's doing it. He's bringing people from every nation in the world into this country to make a laboratory where he can prove his power to unite mankind. Beloved friends, it's not due to anything Americans have that we're being given this bounty. It's because God, in His mercy, chose the most politically corrupt nation on the planet Earth to prove His power, to clean it up and make it the cleanest nation that ever existed on this planet. And to do it, He has to do it through you and the youth today. We have this beautiful banner up at this university up here about youth. Youth can move the world. Taken from is a very strong and powerful quotation that many of you probably know by heart. The quotation that it's taken from, if I can find it quickly here, it says this: it is within your power to contribute significantly to shaping the societies of the coming century. Beloved friends, if we do not arise now, I'm not teasing. I'm not playing games. I'm not trying to use some type of rhetoric to manipulate an audience. If you and I don't arise now and follow the guidance of our House of Justice on finishing this 7-year plan and giving every ounce of movement we have to this International Year of Peace, we are going to have 100 years of peace for sure, but it won't be the kind of peace God intended. That depends on what you and your children do to impregnate this society with the Baha'i principles for peace when this lesser peace is established. We Baha'is, unfortunately, in this country, tend to have come from a Christian background. And the normal Christian believes Jesus is coming on the cloud and bringing His kingdom, and I'm going to sit piously there and let Him come on in with it. We Baha'is, unfortunately, some of us have been guilty of saying the world leaders are going to bring the lesser peace, and I'm going to sit piously by and let them bring it. God have mercy on you. I have lived and worked in police states. There was a man on the Baha'i Studies program a couple of years back from Hungary, Emil Laszlo, who was talking about Baha'is joining hands with others who believe in world government and these principles we believe in this lesser peace type arrangement. So that when the time comes and the world is ready to move into that vacuum and fill it with something to bring mankind together, we move in before those people who are more of inclined nature to want a political domination of a small group to tell everybody what tune to march through. When Moses led his people out of Egypt, God Almighty said, "Go into the promised land." My God, they had had hundreds of years of bondage. And He says, "Get out there, follow your prophet, and go into the promised land." And they left Egypt, and they died in the wilderness. They never got to the promised land because they turned chicken. He said, Moses got out there and said, "Go out here, send your scouts out and look over civilization." And he went out, and they came back, and they started to describe all these fearful things they had to overcome, and they wouldn't do it. They died there. Moses got to just take a peek at the promised land. But the children didn't. They wandered around that desert for 40 years being picked on by the fleas and the dirt and the flies, and they got a belly full of it. And when old Joshua decided to lead them, that young Joshua, they went into the promised land. I hope and I pray that when the end of this century comes, by the year 2000, 15 short years away, 7 years to 1992, the 100th year since the passing of Baha'u'llah, that when the banner of the lesser peace is unfurled, that you and I can stand proudly, shoulder to shoulder, anywhere in the world we may be, knowing that we did our best with our children to help shape the society for the next 100 years, so that we can share the greatest hope that any human ever dared hope. Peace at last. Peace at last. Great God Almighty, peace at last. Allahu Akbar.